Welcome back to the Crimeland channel. Today we are discussing a very famous case, one of those that has generated numerous videos. It is set in my city, Hong Kong, and we're talking about the story that has become famous, especially on the internet, as the Hello Kitty case. The reason it's called that will be explained later in the video if you're not already familiar with this case. This story takes place in 1999. And one of the reasons it caused such a stir is partly because it is one of the most violent crimes ever, but also because such things do not usually happen in Hong Kong, which is a very, very safe city. In fact, it is one of the major cities with the lowest homicide rates in the world. Therefore, the residents of Hong Kong particularly remember this case because it shocked everyone. We find ourselves in the Tsim Sha Tsui district of Kowloon, which is a part of Hong Kong. In May 1999, a 14-year-old girl suddenly appears at a police station in a state of shock. This girl had difficulty speaking due to her agitation, and when the police asked her what had happened, she replied that she was terrified because a ghost was haunting her. She told the police that she had been seeing this spirit every day and every night. It was the spirit of a woman in her 20s, covered in blood. This girl who was there at the police station was convinced that the only way to get rid of this ghost was to go to the police and confess everything. At that moment, the police were taken aback and paused for a moment to ask her, "Excuse me, confess everything about what?" This girl explained that she knew the spirit of this woman, who was the victim of a month-long series of tortures in which she had participated just the previous month. This was why the spirit was haunting her. It was compelling her to confess what she had done. The identity of this girl has been protected because she was a minor at the time, so her name is not known. Nevertheless, the police asked her to lead them to the place where these tortures took place. She took them to an apartment in Kowloon. Kowloon has the highest population density in the world, with a staggering 43,000 inhabitants per square kilometer. But from the 1950s to part of the 1990s, it was not quite like it is today. It was called World City, meaning walled city, because it was indeed walled. Inside those walls, people lived in dramatic conditions, with over 50,000 people living in very tiny spaces. From the 1970s onward, this place became somewhat of a hideout for the local triads, which is the Chinese mafia. These triads controlled the entire walled city, and there was a very high rate of protection, gambling, and drugs. However, in 1995, the Hong Kong government decided to demolish and clear out this walled city. So, when this incident occurs, the walled city had already been demolished and cleared. But obviously, all these illegal activities had not been completely eradicated. In fact, there were still some apartments where drugs were still being dealt. There was still a lot of prostitution, and many activities were still controlled by the triads. This girl brought the police to one of these apartments, but she explained that she was not the only one who inflicted these tortures on this poor woman. She was part of a group and was the only female and the only minor, and has the highest population density in the world, with a staggering 43. Of course, she was not part of the group at the time of these tortures. She had recently turned 14. The reason she had become involved in this situation was that one of these men was her boyfriend. This girl had a very troubled home life. She hated her family and hated being at home, so at one point she decided to run away. She had run away the year before, when she was still 13, and after running away, she had started living and sleeping wherever she could. In doing so, she met these men, and one of them became her boyfriend. This man was 34 years old, and let's remember that she was just 13. These men were involved in shady dealings. They were very powerful and dangerous individuals. This girl was clearly caught up in the wrong crowd and had also started using drugs. But now let's talk about the crime. This woman was named Fan Man-yee, and at the time of her death, she was 23 years old. Not much is known about her or her childhood, but surely she did not have an easy one. One of the few things known is that her parents had abandoned her when she was very young, and she ended up in an orphanage. In this orphanage, once you turned 16, you were considered able to take care of yourself, and thus you were expelled. This was a truly cruel situation, because a person at 16 years old is absolutely not capable of looking after themselves. Therefore, once Fan Man-yee was expelled from the orphanage at 16, she began using drugs and fell into the wrong circles. She started doing illegal work to earn some money to eat and quickly entered the world of prostitution. In May 1996, she met a man in a nightclub who would later become her husband. They got married and had a child, but unfortunately it seemed Fan Man-yee was not destined for happiness. This man turned out to be very violent and aggressive. He beat her daily, and their neighbors could clearly hear him attacking her. As a result, after a short time, this marriage ended and Fan Man-yee left him. At this point, she was alone with the child she loved dearly. She would do anything for him, which often meant stealing to provide for him. In 1997, at the age of 21, she started working in a brothel, and at least she was now doing her job in a somewhat safer place, as she was no longer on the street. This brothel was located in the Kowloon district and was frequented by many dangerous individuals. Many triad members visited that place, and Fan Man-yee knew it. It was here that Fan Man-yee met a powerful and dangerous man named Chan Man-lok, who was also a triad member. Chan Man-lok seemed to like Fan Man-yee very much. She was his favorite prostitute, and so every time he went to the brothel, he asked for her and paid her very well. Although she knew he was a dangerous man, she kept him close because he constantly gave her lots of money. Participated just the previous month. This was why the spirit was haunting her. It was compelling her to confess what she had done. The identity of this girl has been protected because she was a minor at the time, so her name is not known. When Chan Man-lok realized she had stolen his wallet, he became furious, telling her that not only did she have to return the $400 that were inside, but she also owed him $10,000 for disrespecting him. So Fan Man-yee immediately returned the $400 she had stolen, but asked for some time to gather the $10,000 that she did not currently have. Clearly, this is not what a triad member wants to hear, knowing Fan Man-yee could never repay that debt. Man-lok then decided to make her pay back in another way. He called up two of his friends, a 27-year-old man named Lung Shin Cho and a 21-year-old man named Lung Wai Lung, and ordered them to kidnap Fan Man-yee from her home. On March 17, 1999, these two men went to Fan Man-yee's home, kidnapped her, and took her to an apartment in the Tsim Sha Tsui area, which was owned by Man-lok. This was the same apartment to which the girl later led the police. As we discussed earlier, Man-lok's plan was to keep Fan Man-yee captive and force her into prostitution until she had earned the money she owed him. But unfortunately, they did not limit themselves to just that. From the first night, they treated Fan Man-yee as if she were their property, feeling entitled to do whatever they wanted with her. Thus, throughout the first night, they raped and beat her repeatedly for hours until the early morning light, and continued inflicting every kind of torture on her for the following month. The girl who reported everything to the police was actually Man-lok's girlfriend, the 34-year-old man who was associated with her. At one point, Man-lok called his girlfriend to come to join them, telling her to come see something as if he had a new toy to show her. She too then took part in this abomination, albeit to a lesser extent than the other three. But she would not only be a passive observer, she actively participated in the torture. They began to beat Fan Man-yee every day, and after a while it wasn't enough for them to just beat her with their hands. They started using weapons, utilizing any object they could find in that house to inflict pain. They used all the utensils they found in the kitchen, iron bars, pieces of furniture. That apartment was completely wrecked. with them literally breaking the furniture in the apartment and using the pieces of wood to hit Fan Man-Yee. They did things like burning her with plastic straws, heating them up so the melted plastic would drip onto her body, especially on the soles of her feet, burning them to the point where she could not stand. In doing this, they hoped to further subdue her and stop any attempts to escape. These men were so monstrous that during these tortures, they forced Fan Man-yee to laugh and continually tell them how happy she was with what they were doing to her. Obviously, if she didn't comply, she was beaten even more harshly. It had turned into a sick game for them. The situation escalated such that, beyond these horrifying tortures, the men also demanded that Fan Man-yee prostitute herself to earn the money that she owed to Man-lok. At this point, Fan Man-yee was gravely injured, unable to stand, utterly exhausted, let alone service clients arriving constantly. Moreover, the men who came for her had no intention of paying for relations with a woman in such a state. Fan Man-yee was covered in blood and wounds, and could barely keep her eyes open. When Man-lok realized he could no longer exploit her and that she would never repay that debt, in his eyes, she became useless. Consequently, the beatings and tortures intensified. They began to do things such as pouring hot sauce into her eyes and onto all her open wounds. They neither fed her nor gave her water, but forced her to drink her own urine and eat her own feces, and not just her own, but also those of the others involved. When Man-yee refused to comply with any of these demands, she was beaten and tortured even more. After some time, Man-yee was obviously unable to move. She was malnourished, injured, and often unconscious. At this point, these men began to grow bored, as there was no thrill in beating and torturing a woman who lay there looking lifeless and not reacting anymore. One of these monsters came up with a brilliant idea: to tie Man-yee by her wrists to the ceiling so that she would literally become their punching bag. This made it much easier to hit her, and so they did. They tied her up to the ceiling and beat her, leaving her in that state for hours on end. On May 15th, 1999, almost a month after they had kidnapped her, this group of monsters decided to go out for a night on the town and locked up Fan Man-yee in the bathroom to prevent her from escaping. But even if they hadn't locked the door, she wouldn't have been able to go anywhere, as she couldn't even stay awake. They returned home several hours later, completely drunk and high, and didn't even think to check on Fan Man-yee in the bathroom. They went straight to bed, and the next day the 13-year-old girl, who was obviously still with them, woke up and decided to go to the bathroom. When she opened the door, she found Fan Man-yee dead in the bathtub. At that moment, these monsters began to panic because they did not think like normal people. They did not comprehend the risk that a person could die after a month of torture. They absolutely had no idea what to do and needed to find a solution. They had to figure out how to dispose of the body. They started discussing it among themselves, and as night fell, they decided to go to sleep, leaving Man-yee's body in the tub. The next day, coincidentally, the police arrived in that area. This was a coincidence. The police were not there for them, nor were they looking for Man-yee. However, they would occasionally check the area because they were aware that there were still remnants of illegal activities happening there. When the group of monsters realized the police were present, they panicked even more. They needed to find a solution quickly to avoid getting caught. In the end, Man-lok came up with the idea of not keeping Man-yee's body intact, as that would be too obvious and difficult to dispose of. He decided they needed to cut the body into small pieces, remove the skin from the bones, and take out all the organs to place them in plastic bags. They began to cut Fan Man-yee's body into small pieces. They decided to boil the body parts using a pot on the stove to separate the skin from the bones. It appears that while one of them was boiling these body parts, another was preparing noodles right next to it. At one point, they even used the same pot for cooking. They involved the 13-year-old girl in this, assigning her the task of collecting all the organs and remaining pieces to put them into plastic bags to be stored in the freezer. It took them about 10 hours to complete the process. And while they were dealing with Fan Man-yee's remains, they left her head for last. They boiled Fan Man-yee's head too, and while doing so, Man-lok called his girlfriend, the 13-year-old girl, and told her to come look. Initially, she didn't want to, frightened, but he insisted that she think of it as watching a movie. The girl looked inside, and she would later tell the police that it was indeed like watching a film. It didn't impress her because it seemed unreal to her. At this point, you're probably wondering why this case is called the Hello Kitty case. The reason is that when Man-lok finished boiling Fan Man-yee's head, only the skull remained. He decided to take it and hide it inside a Hello Kitty stuffed animal that was in the house. We return to the beginning of the video when the girl led the police to the apartment. When the police opened the stuffed animal and discovered that there was indeed a human skull inside, they understood that this horrifying story was true. All that remained of Fan Man-yee in that apartment was the skull, with a single tooth still attached and some organs in plastic bags in the freezer. Obviously, without a complete body, it was impossible to accurately determine the cause of death, and without a body, they could not even prove that the entire story was true. The police immediately arrested these 3 men and began interrogating them. Their version of the story was completely different, claiming that in that apartment they ran a small brothel where the only prostitute was Fan Man-yee. They said that unfortunately, she had been using hard drugs and one day had overdosed and died. They maintained that when they realized what had happened, they decided to get rid of the body. The trial that followed lasted 6 weeks, during which time they continued to deny having killed Fan Man-yee or having harmed her. They spent the time blaming one another. During the trial, Fan Man-yee's ex-husband also testified, stating that they were definitely lying because Fan Man-yee had not used drugs since she became pregnant with their child. She had been clean since then. Therefore, their theory that she had died of an overdose made no sense. At the end of the trial, all 3 were sentenced to a minimum of 20 years in prison. The 14-year-old girl, however, received total immunity since she had reported everything to the police and led them to the crime scene, so nothing happened to her. During the years in prison, several psychologists and psychiatrists visited these 3 men, but they reportedly never found any signs of mental illness, and additionally, they never showed any signs of remorse. They were clearly 3 psychopaths who felt no emotions. The trial took place in 2000, meaning that in 2020, these men could have appealed and might have been released. We searched for recent information on this matter, but were unable to find anything. The global situation has likely made it difficult to effectively verify what is happening, especially as Hong Kong has not been doing well in recent years. Protests and the pandemic have led to a complicated situation. After this crime and all the rumors that circulated, the idea of living in that building became unimaginable for many. In 2012, the building was demolished, and in its place, a hotel was constructed. In Kowloon, every space is precious, so even a place so stained by a tragedy like this could not remain vacant. Thank you for watching the video, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.